pretty good. Subtle but important changes took place in China's foreign trade regime beginning in the late 1970s, even before the much heralded open door and reform policy was announced. In addition to Chinese language trade magazines, we offered specialized translation and printing services, as well as some research and consulting to companies wanting to sell to China, and the business took off. In the process, living and working in the dynamic business environment of Hong Kong imbued even me with the entrepreneurial spirit. This transformation was made possible through a combination of osmosis, observation, asking a lot of dumb questions, making lots of mistakes, and learning from excellent mentors. Very useful for someone who had never taken an economics, business, finance, or accounting course, and who had been tipped in vocational aptitude tests, which I had taken in high school, as most likely to succeed as a librarian or a forest ranger. I became a regular visitor to the Canton Trade Fair in the 70s and early 80s. Now, commentators tend to focus on 1979 as the start of the open door and reform era, and it was indeed a milestone year in many ways, including the historic normalization of U.S.-China relations in that year. Even in 1978, however, visitors to the trade fair in Canton could see signs of experimentation and subtle signals that possibly bigger changes were around the corner, even though these were often mixed and somewhat paradoxical. To illustrate some of these changes, I'd like to tell a couple of stories from that era. The first is set in the Dongfang Hotel in the late 1970s, before the door was officially open. And this first story relates to change management, which was a huge theme, has been an incredible theme for China these past 30 years. This one has a particular special relevance to the law of unintended consequences. In those days, as I mentioned, the Dongfang's guest rooms had no telephones, and of course they didn't have air conditioners either. Beds were equipped with one of those hanging mosquito nets which would envelop you in sleep if you chose to deploy it. And the bedside table had a small electric fan to keep you cool in the evening. One other thing that those rooms came equipped with was giant cockroaches of the subtropical variety, which I fondly called Cockroachus dongfangensis. As China's foreign trade began to pick up and visitor numbers to the Canton Trade Fair grew, so too did the number of guest complaints about those cockroaches. So along come some salesmen from an enterprising American company which made industrial pest control products. They visited Guangzhou and delivered a technical seminar to the comrades in charge of the Dongfang Hotel. Their products promised to solve the cockroach problem. So a deal was done. The institutional bug bomb was purchased and deployed in time for the spring 1978 trade fair. Sure enough, as that fair opened, many guests commented positively about the seemingly sudden absence of cockroaches. That was the good news. The bad news was that unfortunately, and this is where the law of unintended consequences creeps in, the presence of strong pesticides in the basement of the hotel, which indeed eliminated the cockroaches, had the side effect of making life down there unpleasant for the rats, who as a result migrated upwards in vast numbers. Rats could be seen by day and by night, scampering down the hallways, around the restaurant, into the guest rooms. Alfred Hitchcock would have had a field day. Now, one of my Princeton classmates was also present during this extraordinary mass upward migration of rodents. One night he was sound asleep, clad only in his underwear. Prior to sleep, he had turned on the electric fan, which sat on the bedside table next to his pillow. Suddenly, in the darkness, in the wee hours, he was awakened by an odd noise and the sensation that bits of something were being blown onto his face and pillow. Clackety, clackety, thump, whoosh. Blearily, he grasped for the light. And as it went on, he beheld a horrific sight. A rat had fallen into the electric fan, and bits of its fur, tail, whiskers, etc., were being blown onto him. clack-a-da-thump, clack-a-da-whoosh. Screaming, he ran from his bed, clad only in his undies. Down the hall, he thundered in the direction of the service desk, where there were 2 young Chinese women on duty, but understandably sound asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. And here comes this crazed foreigner galloping towards them, waving and gesticulating madly, far from fully clothed, shouting something about having an old book in his room. What? Due to the state of high anxiety, Jeff's tones had gone a little bit wobbly, so that his effort to say rat, 老鼠, yielded instead the tones for old book, 老书. Very matter-of-factly, and as if they had been trained for exactly such an eventuality, these 2 young ladies followed him back to the room, picked up the rat, which was thoroughly deceased now, and got rid of it. End of story. I've often wondered since that time if either of those 2 young ladies has told that story as frequently as Jeff and I have. I guess not. The second story I'd like to share illustrates the importance of the fact that effective communication requires not only the grasp of language, and I think this was something Ginny talked to in the earlier session this morning, but a grasp of culture. And that means a knowledge of prevailing values and attitudes. Late 1978 was a watershed time during which the pro-reform elements in Chinese leadership exerted their influence decisively and set in motion a series of far-reaching, long-term changes. But there were still powerful anti-reform forces in China's political mix at that time. The years from 1980 to 85 saw groundbreaking new policies in China's foreign trade and investment, as well as new domestic initiatives aimed at decentralizing economic management, reforming agricultural production, and kickstarting the formation of private businesses. This was a time when the seeds of far-reaching, dramatic change were being sown. Policies and directions can be changed from the top, but inevitably it takes time for bold new ideas to sink into ordinary folks' minds. At this time, more and more regions of China were being opened up to foreign tourism. And as it turned out, in the summer of 1978, I had the opportunity to visit Beijing with a visiting American publisher and his wife. We had just concluded a successful new magazine launch together, and our goal was to travel from Beijing to Chongqing and take a ferry boat down the Yangtze to Wuhan. This was before these kind of trips were packaged and marketed. So, unsure of how to set it up, we visited the China Travel Service office in Beijing and asked them if we could make bookings on the boat through them. Could not. So after lengthy discussions with them, they said, well, the best we can do is we can make a call to our Chongqing office and you can talk to them. Maybe they can do it. This was an unusual request. So they placed a call at my cost to the Chongqing office. And once the line was connected, I explained to the Chongqing office in Chinese that we wanted to book 2 first-class tickets, 2 first-class cabins on the boat from Chongqing to Wuhan. Do you have 2 first-class cabins available on August 15th? No. So you're fully booked on that date? No. Then could I reserve 2 first-class cabins, please? No. Is there a ferry boat sailing on that date from Chongqing to Wuhan? Yes. Are the first-class cabins on the date fully booked? No. Is it possible then that we could reserve 2 of those cabins? No. Are there cabins on the boat? Yes. How many cabins? Many. What kind of cabins are available on the boat? Different kinds. Can you tell me in more detail? 6th class, 5th class, 4th class, 3rd class, and 2nd class. So the best class of cabins on the boat is 2nd class. Yes. Do you have 2 2nd-class cabins available on that date? Yes. Can I book them? Yes. Now, I should have known from the outset that in the prevailing mindset of the day, first class still had unwanted bourgeois connotations in the context of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The arrival of more and more foreigners in China in the early 80s created a fair amount of confusion. Generally speaking, the Chinese people responsible for the well-being of foreigners in those days tried very hard to accommodate their needs as well as possible, given the circumstances. And the third story that I'd like to share with you from that era, again, took place in the early stages of the open door policy, when the trickle of foreign residents into China was growing, but still in kind of an early experimental stage, and mainly to Beijing rather than to other parts of the country. And this story, I think, illustrates the respect that we have to have for cultural differences. I had two American friends doing their PhD research in Sichuan province during the early 1980s. And as it happened, there were about a half dozen Americans at the same university at that time doing their research. And their local liaison person, the foreign affairs person, would ask them from time to time if they had any particular needs. And so one of them mentioned in the summer that Thanksgiving was coming up, and that as a group of Americans, it would be really wonderful as an antidote to the homesickness if they could organize a turkey to have a Thanksgiving dinner. The foreign affairs guy was not too optimistic about that because he said, we really don't have any turkeys in China that I know of. But, clearly they were desirous of trying to make this happen if it could. So he said he would do his best as long as they would help the chef cook the turkey if he found it. They agreed to do that, of course. So in the weeks and months that went by, from time to time, he would give them interim status reports, and it wasn't good news. I mean, there were no supermarkets in China at that point, and his inquiries were leading to dead ends on the turkey supply front. But finally, at the 11th hour, he very happily announced that he had found a turkey for them. And they were excited, and they worked together with the chef, and somehow they put together a makeshift but wonderful, happy Thanksgiving dinner. Afterwards, one of these grateful Americans asked the foreign affairs guy where he finally found the turkey. And he explained that having exhausted all other possibilities, and knowing how badly they wanted a Thanksgiving turkey, he had turned to the source of last resort, which was the Chengdu Zoo. It's a true story. I've spoken of far-reaching changes with their beginnings in the late 70s and early 80s, which I was fortunate to witness firsthand. And China's embrace of the open door policy and market economics has unleashed a torrent of phenomenal ongoing change, which has transformed most aspects of the social, economic, and even physical landscape in China, not to mention China's role in the world economy and world affairs. On a personal note, I couldn't have asked for a more interesting or rewarding career path, or a more intellectually stimulating time to be engaged with China's remarkable transformation, and I feel very fortunate in that regard, especially having started the study of Chinese when it was considered a bit of an offbeat, arcane subject here. And I think most of what happened was due to good luck, from having been at the right place at the right time and avoiding any major screw-ups. That luck included starting my business in anticipation of China's opening up, and later shifting the focus of our published products away from trade magazines when it became clear that the next big wave on the horizon was going to be the emergence of the middle class and eventually affluent class in China, as well as a tremendous appetite for management information that resulted from a new landscape of rapid change and in heightened competition in business resulting from the open door and reform policies. So that led us to launch the Chinese edition of Fortune magazine 15 years ago under license from Time Inc. And we now have a circulation in print 18 times a year of 182,000 copies, as well as a robust online presence and active program of conferences and events. And I'd like to close, before we open this up to questions and comments and the hurling of fruit, if necessary, with a few items of advice, if I may. And these are kind of universal guidelines, I think, in terms of planning your career, but I think that certainly they have relevance to China. They may have relevance beyond that, but I guess they're lessons that I've learned anyway.